So just before we get started again, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please go ahead and enter them into the chat box. We will be monitoring that throughout the webinar, and then Will take questions from that during the Q&A portion. So over to you, Will.
All right, thank you very much, Annalise, and thank you everyone for joining us in the latest incarnation of the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policies webinar series on carbon dioxide removal issues. The Institute is a think tank within the School of International Service at American University that focuses primarily on social science aspects, including law, ethics, and policy associated with the emerging suite of technologies that fall under the general rubric of carbon dioxide removal. And today we focus on the issue of the potential role of enhanced oil recovery in the context of carbon dioxide removal technologies. As the impetus for discussing potential deployment of carbon dioxide removal technologies have increased in recent years, one of the nagging questions has been whether the economics will work. Are there sufficient incentives to drive adoption of carbon dioxide removal approaches, or at least to drive research and development in the face of tepid, or in some cases non-existent prices on carbon? Some researchers have suggested that one of the potential ways to help incentivize adoption of these technologies is the use of this carbon dioxide that would be removed from via these technologies in enhanced oil recovery. And enhanced oil recovery, just a working definition, is a process of increasing the amount of recoverable oil from a reservoir, usually by injecting a substance into an existing well to increase pressure and reduce viscosity. And in this case, we're talking about utilizing the carbon dioxide that would be removed from the atmosphere through technologies such as bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and direct air capture. As one can imagine, however, the use of carbon dioxide for these purposes is not without controversy. And that's what we hope to capture today, the potential benefits of doing so from the standpoint of carbon dioxide removal approaches, as well as some of the risks in terms of climate change and some of the economics associated with the use of these technologies. And we have three excellent speakers to help us discuss this issue in some detail. The first of our speakers will be Brian Schneider, who serves as an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Sciences at Louisiana State University. Our second speaker will be Deepika Nagabhushan, who serves as Program Director for Decarbonized Fossil Energy at the Clean Air Task Force. And our final speaker will be John Noel, who is a senior climate campaigner for Greenpeace in the United States. Each of our speakers will start with brief interventions, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers from our audience. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Brian Schneider.
Thank you very much, Will. And I'm going to attempt to share my screen here with hopefully success. Okay, can you all see that, maybe? Assume you can, since I think you might not be able to talk back. Okay, so today, talking about enhanced oil recovery and whether or not that is a bridge to carbon dioxide removal. There's a bunch of potential systems that we could be talking about here. They all have their acronyms. So EOR, enhanced oil recovery, in general, without any sort of carbon capture and storage, that happens a lot in the United States. It happens elsewhere as well, especially in the Permian Basin in West Texas. So that's where you take some carbon dioxide source, some geological reservoir. You move the carbon dioxide from underground, take it to another location, you stick it back underground. So we're not really going to talk, or I'm at least not going to talk about that today. But then the next three sources or systems on that list, carbon capture and storage with EOR, carbon capture and storage without EOR, and then carbon dioxide removal with or without EOR. And I'll focus on the without EOR piece and sort of talk about how they're similar and how some of their challenges are similar. So first, the picture up here at the top is sort of a systems diagram of carbon capture and storage with enhanced oil recovery. So on the left-hand side here, you've got some industrial source. That could be a refinery, it could be a electricity plant that emits some amount of carbon dioxide. You transport that carbon dioxide, usually that's as a supercritical fluid, so at a pretty high pressure. Then in these EOR systems, you inject that carbon dioxide underground, and that produces two things that could be of value. It produces some oil, and in the United States, a $35 tax credit per ton of carbon dioxide injected through this 45Q tax credit that we'll talk about. So the first thing I'm going to talk about today is whether or not that can be cost effective. And then we'll shift to CCS without EOR. So that is essentially the same process for the first three sections of the system over here. But instead of producing oil from that, you only store the carbon, usually in a saline reservoir underground. And in that case, in the United States, you get a $50 per ton tax credit for the first 12 years of operation. So first, let's start with talking about whether or not that top figure makes some economic sense. So some colleagues and I were interested in sort of, can this make sense, at least if you're using high purity CO2 sources? So there's roughly 500-600 sources in the United States, industrial sources that produce carbon dioxide in a relatively concentrated stream. So ammonia, ethanol, ethylene oxide, natural gas processing all produce carbon dioxide in above 95% purity. So the waste that, or some of the emissions that comes out of those facilities is relatively pure, or in some cases entirely pure CO2. Hydrogen production produces something like 40-45% pure CO2. So we said, okay, we've got these pure sources of CO2. Can we use them in an EOR context? We did some modeling. We found out that it sort of depends on some maybe expected parameters like oil price and the purity of your source, the reservoir geology. And we illustrated that in this one field down here in South Louisiana called Parody. Parody is down here where that big ammonia spike is. And we found out, okay, well, if you have a range of oil prices, this is in this bottom table here, $30 to $70. For those pure streams, those essentially 100% pure streams, natural gas, ammonia, and ethylene oxide, yeah, it makes a tremendous amount of sense. Even at relatively low oil prices, you can make several $100 million in this EOR system. But the catch is, if you move to those less pure systems like hydrogen, or if you move to even less pure systems, like say a coal-fired power plant, which is usually in 5 to 15% range purity, then the system does not break even. And then we could ask questions like, well, does it make any ecological sense? Does it actually help with climate? And again, maybe not surprisingly, the answer is going to be it depends. So this table over on the left is from data from sort of older EOR fields. And they said, well, how much CO2 do you emit from the oil you produce compared to how much CO2 you stick underground? And in general, it's something like 2 to 3 times the CO2 is emitted as the CO2 is injected underground. But that, at least there's some thought that number has been declining. And so in our model, again in Parody, it actually reached kind of close to parity, pardon the pun, where the amount of CO2 you inject was roughly equal to the amount of CO2 you would emit from from the combustion of that oil. And that's just because the parity field is not as good, or we think it would not be as good at producing oil after CO2 injection as those earlier fields were, which makes a certain amount of sense. Okay, so that is CCS with EOR. So now let's think about CCS without EOR and whether or not that is economic. So we create another model, right? Because I guess that's what I do. And we asked about whether or not that $50 per ton tax credit in the 45Q law is enough to sort of stimulate carbon capture and storage without EOR. And again, we focused on these really high purity streams. And we found the sort of disappointing result at first was, okay, well, in general, no. It's not enough to stimulate carbon capture and storage. And part of that is because of this 12-year expiration. So, okay, we said, well, what if Congress gets rid of that 12-year expiration, because firms have been pretty good at, kind of extending some tax credits. So let's say they get rid of that. And this figure over on the left shows that. So the dotted figures are the ones with the 12-year expiration, solid lines without the 12-year expiration. And so the kind of break-even cost decreases, as you would expect. But we still have this problem, which is that most of these pure sources are relatively small. So something under about 500,000 tons of CO2 a year. Some do get bigger, but most are in that range. And there's these economies of scale that make it difficult for systems to break even. So we said, okay, well, what if we think sort of outside the box and we link a whole bunch of small systems together in these clusters? And then what if we allow those systems to not transport that CO2 in a supercritical phase, because that's really expensive if you're a small system, but to transport them in a gaseous phase, which I think actually makes some degree of sense. And we got this figure on the right, this map on the right, which are all these different clusters that we can kind of pull together. And those are the systems that we feel like make economic sense at that $50 per ton tax credit if you have these sort of innovative ways of clustering them together. The catch here is that still amounts to something like 22 million tons of CO2 per year, which is something like 0.5% of US CO2 emissions. So still not an awful lot of CO2. Okay, so then if we move to carbon dioxide removal, we already had, so the CCS with EOR, that's challenging but doable. The CCS without EOR is doable, but in a very limited number of circumstances. And now we need to move to CDR, to carbon dioxide removal. And we've got another problem there, which is that everything I've talked about, you're talking about CO2 that is at a very high purity. Now, in CDR, we're taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, where it's at about 410 parts per million. And because of that, and because of the second law of thermodynamics, the energy to capture that CO2 is always going to be pretty high. And in most cases, that means the cost is also going to be high. So you're taking a system that was already difficult to make cost competitive, and you're making it even more challenging. So what can we do about that? Well, one option, and so here I've kind of linked the CCS with EOR, which is the most cost effective, the CDR, which is probably the least cost effective in systems that I'm talking about today. And you notice that in the middle, the infrastructure is the same, or at least it's very similar. So the CO2 transport is very similar, right? Those are CO2 pipelines. We could use them for either system. The CO2 injection is not identical because you need to drill new wells, but it's still pretty similar. And so then the question is, can we use the EOR infrastructure as sort of a literal bridge? Instead of a bridge that's a physical bridge, a bridge that's a pipeline. So can we use the same sorts of bridges in the EOR system in the carbon dioxide? And so just to sort of wrap up, the take-home messages, I guess, for me are any carbon storage system is very hard to make economic. And that's because of two things. One is the second law of thermodynamics, and there's not a whole lot we can do about that. The other is policymakers, and I'm not sure that they're any less intransigent than the second law. And this kind of the graph here on the left, I hope maybe illustrates that. So this is, if you're a company and you're faced with the choice of either doing storage without EOR or storage with EOR, CO2 injection with EOR, the top line is that the revenue you generate, not including costs, but the costs are probably pretty similar, the revenue you generate with EOR or as oil prices increase versus the revenue you generate without EOR. And so you can see the revenue from the EOR system is an awful lot higher, and yet the carbon benefit is probably an awful lot lower, and that's because of this $35 EOR credit and $50 no EOR credit. So if that's the world we live in, where we've got an incentive to do EOR and less of an incentive to do anything without EOR, then using some of these EOR infrastructure and maybe even CDR, carbon dioxide removal with EOR, may help meet some of those increased capital costs. So with that, I will stop and turn it back over to.
Oops. Thank you so much, Brian. And I'll now turn it over to our second speaker, Deepika.
Thanks, Will. Let me just get my screen share up. There we go. Make that big. All right. I hope that you can see my screen. Ouch. I need to get rid of my... Oh, okay, there it is. That's what it was. All right. Sorry about that. Thank you, Will, for having me on this webinar. And in the interest of time, I am going to skip right to it. My presentation is going to focus on the role for EOR in scaling CCS, very similar to the points that Brian just made. But I'll sort of put my main message out there in one line. Without CCS, we can't get rid of all of our CO2 emissions, which we have to do by mid-century. And we can't scale CCS fast enough without EOR being part of the mix. And I'll start with like a 2-minute summary of the 4 top takeaways from my presentation, just in support of that main message. And then I'll do 7 slides. I was given 10 minutes, so I hope that I can use the time to do this. Okay, first point, we've got a wide scale CCS is essential to getting to a net zero carbon economy. And that's because without CCS, we can't get rid of about 30% of global emissions, as these come from what we call hard to decarbonize sectors. Second point, CCS can't scale fast enough without EOR. It's because EOR projects are operational today. EOR industry has decades of experience, and some are even ready to pay for anthropogenic CO2 and store them under the right regulations. And in fact, EOR has been one of the reasons that CCS has even been deployed so far, for it to have reached a price point that we have it at today. Third point, geologically storing CO2 through EOR is in fact carbon reducing. You get about 63% net reduction for every ton that you store via EOR. And this, of course, assumes that the storage is done right with the right kind of monitoring and verification. Final point, I would argue that 45Q is only one step in the right direction. We need a portfolio of policies that include and leverage the EOR market to drive this transition into a zero carbon energy system. And now I'll take about 7 minutes or 8 minutes into the 7 slides that I have prepared. Okay, first point. All of IPCC's 1.5 degree pathways meet the goal by zeroing out emissions by 2060. So we've got to get there. 3 of the 4 pathways relied on CCS. One that did not instead decided to rapidly downsize world energy consumption by about 32%. Even in the IPCC 2 degree modeling, what we found was that 7 out of 11 models could not even reach the 2 degree goal without CCS. 4 models that did do it did so at a cost that was 138% higher than the others. Point being that making policy choices today that would limit CCS deployment in any way would mean that we're betting on pathways that have a higher risk of missing our climate targets. So how exactly does CCS even help build this zero carbon energy system? I want to sort of show that in this graphic. As you can see at the bottom, we've got primary sources of energy being renewables, nuclear, and fossil energy. In the second row, you have how the energy is delivered. It's delivered in the form of zero carbon electricity and zero carbon liquid fuels. And the end use on the top row is we've got heating in buildings, lighting, the electricity, the transport and heating, high temperature heating needed in industry, all using these new forms of energy. So it kind of goes to show that there has to be changes in all parts of this system. And where CCS fits is using fossil to convert that into zero carbon electricity, convert fossil energy into zero carbon fuels. But also CCS helps in taking CO2 out of industrial process emissions that have nothing to do with fossil energy to begin with. And also what's not in this picture is direct air capture. And as Brian rightly pointed out, the storage system, the storage infrastructure is pretty much common irrespective of where the CO2 comes from. And that brings me to my third point about CO2 emissions, which is that CCS is essential to decarbonizing hard to decarbonize sectors, which account for around 30% of global emissions. So let's talk a bit about why they are called hard to decarbonize and why CCS is helpful there. And I'll use an example of cement for making that illustration. In a cement plant, 60% of the emissions are process related, meaning they have nothing to do with the use of fossil fuels. 40%, on the other hand, is related to the use of fossil fuels to generate high temperature heat. Now, if we were to sort of switch how we generate high temperature heat with zero carbon fuels like hydrogen, we'd get rid of 40% of the emissions, but we'd still have 60% of the emissions left to remove. And I think Brian alluded to this as well. When you lower the concentration of CO2 from a from an exhaust stream, you're making it harder for CCS to remove those CO2 emissions. So the best or more realistic option for cement would be to do a full CCS on the plant. In several situations, this would be the most realistic way to decarbonize cement. And that's why it's hard to decarbonize, and that's why CCS plays an important role. And there are other sectors like that, like iron and steel. And then, as you can see in the graph on the right, you've got aviation, shipping, long-distance road transport, and load-following electricity, which all need to rely on technologies like CCS to realistically take all of that CO2 out, and that's about 30% of global emissions. Now we're in the EOR section of my slide deck, and the graphic on the right here represents about 27 projects that have made public announcements for doing CCS. There might be more out there that we haven't heard of that are probably in early stages of development, but these are the ones that have made public statements and they say how they're going to store their CO2. If you look at the first two bars, we've got about 7 projects that have been given funding under the US Department of Energy's Carbon Safe program, and they're going to do saline using that funding. And even amongst those 7, you've got 2 of them that say that they will simultaneously do EOR. Jump to the right-hand side, you've got a saline bar that has 7 projects that want to do saline but have no funding from the government. As Brian pointed out, it is a little risky because you don't end up making any money after the 12-year period, after the 45Q incentive goes away. So it's really a question about how successful these projects might end up being. In the center, however, we've got about a dozen projects that say that they want to do EOR, and they're likely going to plug into some existing EOR operation. So my point to show in showing this graph is basically to say that if we were to use a strategy that removed EOR in our endeavor to develop CCS and deploy CCS, we'd lose about a dozen projects and kind of rely mainly on fewer government-funded projects. And at this stage, when every project counts to bring the cost of the technology down, this might be a risky strategy. And this picture is of Denver City CCS hub in the Permian Basin. And it's basically one of the hubs. And yesterday we saw the announcement for the Alberta trunk line in Canada. All are sort of hubs that are driven by EOR. And, the US built about 5,000 miles of CO2 pipelines without any climate policy in place. So, and projects today, as you saw in the previous slide, projects today are wanting to plug into this system to already start storing CO2. And even though the EOR industry so far has mainly relied on natural CO2, even those projects that relied on anthropogenic CO2 have been the reason we've got CCS deployed so far. Even Petronova was not built to take advantage of 45Q. It was built on partially government funding and EOR economics. So, and that project has helped commercialize a capture technology from a company called MHI. So my point is that CCS has even come to this point where it makes sense to make climate policy around it, has sort of come to this price point only because it has been deployed outside of climate policy. And so EOR industry has already played a role in bringing the costs down, and we should leverage this industry going forward to bring the costs of this technology down further. And here's the other thing I'd like to also say about EOR, as I think Will mentioned in his definition right up front. CO2 is not the only thing that EOR industry can use for doing EOR. If there is a demand for oil, they'll probably do EOR using some other surfactant. And what happens with that is that we just, as people who want to see more CCS deployed such that costs can come down, we're going to lose out on that opportunity to deploy the technology fast. And I also want to make this point about the EOR and its net reduction, storage through EOR and net reduction of emissions. The IEA study on this from 2015 finds that CO2 storage through EOR is in fact net reducing. And of course, this assumes robust monitoring verification of storage. But for every ton that you use in EOR and you store it through EOR processes, you get a net reduction well to wheels of about 63%, because downstream you're increasing emissions, by increasing global oil supply. So this sort of number includes global oil market changes, and you get a net 63% reduction. And this is my last slide, and I just want to say that John Noel is up next on this webinar, and I know that John has his reasons to believe that we must decouple EOR from CCS deployment. But I'd like to leave you with this idea that EOR is part of the solution, and they have already been, as I described. We just need more policies to get CCS deployed more widely that can leverage EOR's capacity that is existing today to store CO2. And I think that this helps create a pathway for a future oil company that is in primarily the business of CO2 storage and potentially also supplying zero carbon energy. And what we must do is we must incentivize these pathways, ensure that we have the right regulations and incentives in place. And it would mean that we create markets for zero carbon fuels and also provide the right kinds of incentives for pushing CCS deployment. And that could include an immediate step right in front of us, which is to modify the 45Q incentive to suit current economic conditions, converting the tax credit into direct pay, extending the commence construction window. But mainly my point here is that 45Q is only one step in the right direction. We need more policies to deploy CCS that can also leverage existing markets that we have in EOR. And with that, I hand it back over to Will.
Thank you very much for that, Deepika. Now we'll turn to our last speaker, John Noel.
Cool. You good? Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Oops, pardon me. Sorry about this. Y'all, it has been a wild couple days on Spaceship Earth. I admittedly am not as prepped as I would have been for a presentation like this because of what's going down across the country. But for me, what's going on in Washington, D.C., which is where I've lived for 10 years. On Saturday, people were gathering peacefully in Lafayette Park, right outside the White House, and protesting police brutality. And Trump ordered the U.S. Park Police to shoot people just sitting around, peacefully assembling with rubber bullets, tear gas, flash grenades, in a type of response that is not American. And escalated beyond that to calling in essentially the military, federalizing our National Guard, bringing in the FBI, ATF, Coast Guard, Homeland Security, ICE, regular police. I mean, this is a military occupation. There are vehicles driving around the streets that people who live here used to drive in Afghanistan. 2 nights ago, there were helicopters 30 feet off the ground chasing protesters away. Right, so this is what we're dealing with. And there are power structures in place that make this type of state response to peaceful protest possible and acceptable. Right? And right now, those power structures are staffed by the Republican Party and funded by the oil and gas industry. That's not in dispute. This type of state-sponsored terror is also nothing new to communities who live on the front lines of oil and gas expansion. Talk to any indigenous community that's tried to stand up against an oil and gas project. Right? State-sponsored terror at the request of the oil and gas industry. Again, staffed primarily by the Republican Party, but not wholly, and funded by the oil and gas industry. What does this have to do with what we're talking about today? Almost everything. EOR reinforces these power structures. It legitimizes the oil industry in the most important conversation of our time, confirms we have not learned anything from the last 30 years of climate negotiations, and undercuts the progress of the climate movement. It is a serious miscalculation of time and resources and legitimizes not a good faith actor, this isn't even controversial to say. It's written and proven. So it has been pretty unbelievable here, right? And if you are on record, so to get back to what we're talking about, David Roberts wrote a whole series on EOR and CDR, which is pretty good. And he goes through all the different arguments. But one of the key points here, and I'm sure he writes this with love and respect for everyone who works in climate policy, as I do, including people on this call. But there is a willful naivete that the oil and gas industry is going to play ball. So I understand the arguments being made here today and almost agree that they could work, right? They could work if we were in the Sim City video game, where we could perfectly design our decarbonization agenda and get everything in place and redesign the Permian Basin and the ethanol factories and get the pipelines in order, etc. But we know that that is not how it works because of the power structures that are in place and the stranglehold that the oil industry has over all levels of government, right? If anything, the COVID response and recovery process at the federal level proves that we're living in a petro state, right? They have access at all levels of government and influence that we can't even understand. So again, I do understand the arguments that are being made here. We just don't accept them. Because getting to this potential that we saw in the last two presentations requires, as IEA says, a paradigm shift of current practices. Paradigm shift. There is nothing in the history of the oil industry that indicates that they are willing to even talk about a paradigm shift in regulations. The closest thing we have is the 45Q tax credit, right? And I worked very closely with the Senate office to secure an IRS Inspector General investigation into the 45Q tax credits because we knew it was being manipulated by the oil and gas industry. The results of this investigation came back a couple weeks ago. Pretty startling. I knew it was going to be bad, but I didn't know the numbers were going to be like that. 87% of the credits claimed in the 45Q tax credit were claimed improperly. Improperly means they didn't attempt to do the monitoring, reporting, and verification claim, which is essential to public confidence for geologic sequestration going forward. They just didn't even do it. If the projects went forward, they didn't even do it. Close to $900 million, right? Improperly. So IRS did claim, claw back, and deny a couple of these projects, which is good. There's still a couple $100 million outstanding, and they will not tell us which companies are responsible for this type of behavior. But again, legitimizing the oil and gas industry in these climate mitigation policies, this is what you get. Not surprising at all. And there is nothing to stop this type of behavior from happening going forward. In fact, we can predict it. Then there's also the resource potential here, and so this gets back into the willful naivete. No one knows what's going to happen when we give the oil and gas industry all the incentives that they're asking for to streamline EOR projects, right? There is so much oil on deck that could be produced under certain conditions. Who knows what's going to happen? But this is what they're saying in their presentations. The prize. This is the prize, right? I don't know how. So if you work backwards from the IPCC threshold that they talk about in the reports, it implies a fundamental transformation of how we produce and consume energy this decade, right? And it's primarily coming from fossil fuels. So it implies that that has to change. this future is not endorsed by the oil and gas industry. They like to talk about CCS on the back end, but not about the fundamental transformation needed this decade for production and consumption of their products. That's why it is so dangerous to legitimize them in these conversations going forward. There's also this idea that EOR is only in like your granddaddy's oil fields. We'll just do EOR in the old fields, capture residual oil, and that'll be it. But there are already pilot projects underway. There are federal level funding to perfect CO2 EOR in unconventional resources, which would unlock a ton of oil there too. We don't know what that'll do to our future potential for dismantling the oil and gas industry, right? This reinforces those power structures that we're seeing on hand right now. That's not talked about by the oil industry, how they're trying to expand into unconventional resources. And we know about the history of federal funding for hydraulic fracturing, that they will perfect this in those reservoirs, and that will lead to carbon lock-in. We need to directly confront the power of the oil and gas industry. There is no other way to do this. We need to leverage them out of the climate policy negotiation circle where they cannot control their fate, and then invite them back in on the people's terms. This is the exact opposite of how climate policy has been done over the last 30 years. And we believe this time, this period that we're living in right now, is a moment. Arundhati Roy has written, the pandemic is a portal, right? It's this gateway between one way of living and the other. And there is an opportunity here. But we need to believe that it is possible and that all of us working together can take on the power of the oil and gas industry. We have to do this. We cannot dance around it. They are not on our side. There are good people that work on these companies, of course, but they are not part of a climate safe future. Check. And here's a bunch of resources that Greenpeace has put together following the lead for the movement of Black Lives, a number of things that people can do that are watching this. I'll hand it back over to Will.
All right. Thank you very much for that, John. We now have a fair amount of time for questions, so I'm going to try to curate some of those and designate them in cases where there's specific speakers that were asked to respond. First question is, if I understand it correctly, the 63% reduction in CO2 claimed by Deepika contradicts Brian's findings. Could Brian comment on that, please? So I'm going to ask Brian to comment, and then Deepika, please weigh in if you wish subsequently.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so what's happening here is there's two different kind of metrics going on. Okay, so I think the metric that Deepika was talking about is, okay, let's say you have 2 barrels of oil, and 1 barrel is produced with EOR, and 1 barrel is produced without EOR. The barrel that's produced with EOR will have a lower net carbon impact on the troposphere. So that's kind of one way of looking at it. The way of looking at it that I was looking at it was kind of ignoring the fact that you could produce barrels of oil from other sources. And so what is the total net greenhouse gas effect of this barrel of oil that's produced with EOR? I'm not sure if I'm making as much sense as I had hoped to make in my head. So yeah, does that answer the question?
I'll just add, though, to your thing. You brought up a good point, though. So let me just clarify first. The 63% number or the share is actually attributed to the source. So if I took 1 ton of CO2 from a power plant, let's say, and put it into an EOR operation, and then that oil went out and you put it in your car and then you drove around, the city, and you emitted some of that back, that 63% net reduction is attributable to the source, taking into account well to wheels. So all of that, but it's attributable to the source. If I want to turn it around and attribute it to the oil, then I can't attribute it to the source. You can only count it once. There's only 1 ton being stored in this example. So you can only count the 63% off that 1 ton. So let's say 0.63 tons. I can either attribute it to the power plant or I can attribute it to the oil. And if I did attribute it to the oil, then it will be 37% per barrel of oil. It won't be 63%. So depending on which side you want to give credit, or which part of the value chain you want to give, policy design, credit, the percentage number will depend on that. So, and that's why it's a good point, because I feel like that's the kind of flexibility we must have in policy design, so we can attribute the reduction of emission on any part of the value chain, so that we can find the best way to incentivize carbon capture deployment.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think Ramon from BEG in Texas mentioned that in the comments that they have done some modeling on kind of green oil, so injecting more carbon into the reservoir than actually is emitted when you burn the oil. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's plausible, but it's going to depend, and I would imagine I would agree, it's going to depend a whole lot on the geology of the reservoir and the life cycle of the system, how far you're transporting the CO2, how you're getting the CO2, how you're capturing the CO2, all that kind of stuff. So it's a complex.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much for that. Next question. Doesn't the IEA 2015 study assume an oil price of over $110 per barrel, rising to $150 per barrel by 2050? How does the current low oil price environment affect projections about price elasticity and demand displacement?
So, Ramon, Joe, sorry. I just wanted to point out that the IEA study doesn't have a specific oil price that they assume, as far as I can tell from the study. I'm looking at it right now. There's only an assumption on price elasticity in the short term and in the long term. And that's what they use to determine the change in consumption of oil, which in the 63% scenario, it is assumed to be 20%, meaning 80% of EOR produced oil is sort of assumed to displace existing oil supply, and 20% is assumed to be additional, which means that you have more emissions from that. But I'd also say that they have done sensitivity analysis on that, and they find that even if the displacement is brought down from 80 to 50%, meaning 50% is displaced and 50% is additional, you will still see net reductions up until that point. And the assumption that also makes this number a little bit conservative is that they assume equivalent oil to be displaced, but in reality, it is possible that more carbon-intensive oil gets displaced, and at that point, the climate benefit is more. But in this assumption, they're using sort of equal carbon intensity oil being displaced.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much for that question. Another question is whether the untraditional sources that John mentioned that potentially would become accessible with EOR changes the calculus at all in terms of our assumptions about CO2 savings. Brian or Deepika in that context?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great point, for sure. Like, it's an economic system. And so if you develop some new technology that lowers the cost of accessing resources, that's going to have impacts. There's no doubt about it. My kind of perspective on the overall system is, or the overall climate policy world, is that we have really no good options. And so I guess I'm not as optimistic about human nature as would be required to think that we can do this without CCS and EOR. I don't think we're going to change the political structure. I wish we could. Anyway.
And I'd like to add that I think the focus really should remain CCS here. And if we're incentivizing storage, if we're incentivizing CCS and allowing CCS to take advantage of existing industry, I think that we have to understand that as it gets deployed on for EOR, we will also be deploying it simultaneously also on saline. Yes, it might be more hard to do in the beginning, but as we get more and more deployment, we'll get the technology to lower in costs, where saline will become more and more economic, and we have to focus on building infrastructure to get saline to become viable. And so I don't think we can discuss this in a vacuum as though we're just doing EOR. I think that we're talking about leveraging any existing industry that might pay for this to get to a point where we can probably find that end game, which is doing more saline. And there will have to be more saline than EOR in the end, because of just the kind of resources we have.
Just to hop in for a second, I mean, that, just respectfully, Brian, that's like a surrendering before we even started. We have to change the political structure. And there are millions of people out here trying to do that. There is no other choice. The current political structure cannot continue. I mean, and so this type of legitimizing the oil industry going forward is undercutting all the good work that's being done to change the political structure, right? And so, like, it's fine to think like that, but at the very least, like, people need to get out of the way, because we are changing the political structure.
All right. Okay. I think we have time for at least one more question. The next question is the voluntary market also an object for project development besides 45Q or others, such as using the ACR methodology?
If I understand the question correctly, an example of a voluntary market might be the LCFS in California. The LCFS does not mandate CCS. However, it allows it as an option for anyone that might want to take advantage of the market that exists, and the market is pretty lucrative, which is about $200. It kind of ranges. The highest is around $200 a ton for CO2. So yes, I think that it is definitely already, we're seeing some project developers that want to both take advantage of the 45Q and the LCFS and thinking of deploying CCS. So I think the answer is yes. I don't know what the ACR methodology is. I'm sorry.
Neither do I, but I'd agree. I think the voluntary market has a potential, but we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in capital investment. So it's a challenge, I guess. Everything's a challenge.
Okay, so it's American Carbon Registry. Thank you.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
All right, we have time, I believe, for one more question, which is a fairly capacious and weighty one. So we'll stop. We'll conclude with this one, and any of you of the speakers could weigh in. The last presentation made an argument from ethics, which advocated for a political transformation. My sense is that Deepika and Brian might disagree with the ethical conclusions raised. However, there might be other ethical issues that emerge from their research. In their estimation, what are the most significant ethical dilemmas of EOR short of social transformation?
So, from my perspective, what is needed is not just a political transformation, but an economic transformation to a system in which we don't actually value economic growth anymore, and we degrow the economy a little bit, or maybe a lot. That raises a huge ethical problem of who gets to maintain their wealth and who gets to grow their wealth. Some people are frankly too poor in the world, and some people are too rich, and how do you do that? But that's sort of like an overarching theme, and I don't know how to get to that either. Like I actually don't disagree with John. I would love for a political transformation. I probably agree with his ethics in general. I'm just too pessimistic to think that either what I was talking about with the steady state economy or degrowth economy, or the sort of political transformation where we maintain the maybe more of a growth economy. I am kind of pessimistic about human nature, I suppose. I'm not a lot of fun at parties either.
I think Brian said it. I come from India originally, and there is this dilemma of growth versus like climate. And I pointed out in my first slide on the IPCC modeling, the one pathway for 1.5 degree modeling that does not use CCS chooses. It is able to meet 1.5 degree target only by reducing global energy consumption by 32%. And I have to imagine, what does that do to my home country? And is that a pathway? So I don't know if we want to back ourselves into that corner. That is an ethical question that I think about.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We have reached the hour, and thus we'll conclude this webinar. As you can imagine, this is an area that's redolent with technical issues, economic issues, ethical and legal issues, and many of them of which are highly contested. And so I'd like to thank the speakers for outlining some of those issues as we move forward and continue to discuss whether this is either a viable option or whether it's a judicious option. And I think we got a good overview of that, both in terms of the presentations and in terms of the questions that followed. So once again, I'd like to thank our speakers, Brian Schneider, Deepika Nagabhushan, and John Noel for their interventions, as well as the participation of those that joined the webinar. And I'd like to encourage everyone to join us for future webinars that discuss other aspects of carbon dioxide removal, and also follow other developments on our website. Thank you very much. Stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. Goodbye now.
Thank you.